As we continue now with our study of the hard sayings, again we turn to the epistles of the New Testament. And the one that we have today is important for several reasons, and frankly, for reasons far beyond the particular matter that is addressed in the text. And I'm referring now to this question of women wearing head coverings in church. I know that there are some churches that get into great controversy about this, but for the most part, in the church today, at least in the American church, that tradition of women covering their heads in worship on Sunday morning has been abandoned. Now, this passage is replete with difficulties for us living in the 20th century outside of the local situation of the Corinthian congregation. And it raises a bigger question than the immediate question of head covering. And the question is this: what is the Christian's obligation with respect to keeping customs that were kept in biblical times? Virtually every biblical scholar recognizes the distinction between principle and custom. Principles are those commands of God that apply to all people at all time, in every culture and in every life situation. Customs are those things which are variant, local applications of principle. For example, in the New Testament, the principle of tithing is there, and in those days it was done through the denarius or the shekel. Does that mean that the only way we can please God today is by paying our tithes in shekels or denarii? Of course not. The monetary unit was customary. The clothing styles, those are the things that are subject to change from culture to culture, from place to place. The principle of modesty applies to all generations, but how that modesty is manifested will differ from one country to another and from one time to another. We understand that those things are customary. So many times, distinguishing between custom and principle is a relatively easy matter, but not always. Sometimes it's excruciatingly difficult to make that distinction. Let me give you a principle to apply if you can't decide if something's a custom or a principle. Biblical principle would be whatever is not of faith is sin. And so the burden of proof is always going to be on those who argue that such and such a command is custom and not principle. If you're not sure, then the principle that applies is treat it as a principle. Because if you treat a custom as a principle, the only guilt you bear is for being overly scrupulous. But if you take a principle of God and treat it as a local custom and don't observe it, you have sinned against God. The argument that you read in almost every commentary is this: that we know that in Corinth, that one of the signs of the prostitute was not a red light over her door, but it was the sign of the uncovered head. And Paul is saying, he's telling the Corinthian ladies, for heaven's sakes, don't come to church looking like prostitutes. Now here's the problem with that. I don't doubt for a minute that there was a problem with prostitutes in Corinth. And I think that it's very helpful to go and examine the cultural situation, the life setting in which that scripture comes, to try to gain clues for understanding the whys and the wherefores of certain admonitions. I think that's a very appropriate thing. I think, on the other hand, it's totally inappropriate to assign to Paul a reason for his saying something that is different from the one he himself gives. Paul does not leave us without a rationale or for a defense of covering the head. And the thing that is most astonishing here is that he appeals to creation, not to Corinth, where he appeals to man and woman as man and woman. And if anything transcends local custom, it is those things that are rooted and ordered in creation. That's why I'm very frightened to be loose with this passage.